You know, when we talked about this last week, we talked about a bunch of types and shadows that we could see in this. After our services last week, Jeff and I was sitting at the back, and Jeff was rattling off shadow after shadow after shadow about the wood being representative of the cross of Christ, about the binding, how Isaac was bound willingly, and how Jesus was bound willingly on the cross, and how Abraham is a type of the Father who has given his only begotten Son, and so on and so forth. I mean, we could continue on with these types and shadows that we talked about last week. And very often as we read these narratives in the Old Bible, maybe we don't stop and think about, and I for one don't stop and think about the detail that is given us about Jesus Christ coming and his death and resurrection on the cross. We're going to see, and this is kind of a snippet once we make it into chapter 23, where Isaac's going to get a wife by the name of Rebekah from the family of Abraham's brother Nahor. We're going to find that's a shadow too of what to come. God just didn't say, Abraham, you go to any people and get Isaac a wife. He went to God's people, or Abraham's people, to get Isaac a wife. That's a shadow of the bride of Christ, isn't it? God doesn't tell us to go anywhere to get a wife. Jesus is not going to go anywhere to get a wife. Who's the bride of Christ? The church. So we find that as we look at this, and we're going to see down at the end of this chapter here in chapter 22, there's another shadow here. There's a shadow of what we would call denominationalism today. We're going to find that there were non-authorized concubines or wives that gave birth to these children that were never authorized by God. That's man's temper. Remember, we've already talked about that Isaac was a promised seed, and when Abraham had petitioned God on behalf of Ishmael, what did in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 19, what did God tell Abraham about Ishmael? Basically, no. Basically, no. That's the son of your doing. That's not the son of my doing. So we can already see a coming of man's tampering with the way God wants things done and the way man does things. And i.e., we can see all the different religious bodies around about us today being a shadow of what was going on back then. God never authorized concubine. That was a customary thing set up by man. God authorized one man and one woman. And so we find that these things were allowed because they lived under an imperfect system. And that's one of the things that we have to remember. And the Apostle Paul there at Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17 had this to say about those things of old when he was talking to those people there. He said here in Acts chapter 17 and verse 30, verse 29, for as much then we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone or graven by arts and man's devices. At the times of this ignorance, God winked at. God knew that was an imperfect system. So God tolerated that, but he was steadily working to bring in that which is perfect. And so we have these things written that the Apostle Paul said both to the church at Rome and the church at Corinth, that they are examples unto us that we can learn. We can learn from these things. One of the things that we've learned so far is God doesn't need Bobby's opinion inserted into his plan, does he? Bobby's opinion will lead you somewhere, probably in the wrong direction, okay? Because I'm man, right? And this is what we see in these events here with the life of Abraham. God doesn't need any help. And so we find that this has led Abraham up to this point to become the father of the faithful. Now we stop and think about what went on here in verse 10 when Abraham stretched forth his hand and he took that knife to slay his son. Now one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is this: would we have been willing to do that? Is our faith at the point to where we would do that if God commanded us to do it. Now we know today God's not going to command us to do that, but we have to stop and think about Abraham had 3 days to think about this. That's another shadow that we talked about, Jeff. 3 days. It's kind of interesting that it was Jonah was in the whale's belly 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus was in the grave, what, 3 days or 3 nights? 3 is an important number in the Bible. And there are other examples of 3s. And so we have Jesus agonizing in the cross at about going to the cross at Calvary, praying in the garden. What about Abraham? It doesn't say he was agonizing over it, but he had 3 days to think about it. Now, you put yourself in his shoes. What would your thoughts have been as you was headed toward what would later become Calvary? It's referred to that where Abraham done this, actually is at where Jerusalem was going to be located in the future. Now that's a shadow, isn't it? Isn't that amazing? That the sacrificial lamb is going to be given at the same place that Jesus was crucified. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, I think we miss a lot of that. And so we find that he took forward the knife to slay his son. That's how far his faith had came in 50 years. Not overnight, not the next day, not next week, not next month, Reed, not next year. But it was a gradual working process is what we see to get him to that point. Brother Kahn is probably, and is the oldest member here. He can probably tell you that the point to where he's at in his life didn't happen 50 years ago, did it? Or 60 years ago. It's a building process, wasn't it? Yeah. It's a building process. And so we find that God has us in this building process. And notice something that Abraham, that says here in verse 11, when the angel of the Lord called out unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here am I. Now God knew where Abraham was at. He knew what Abraham was doing. When Abraham said, Lord, here am I. God, here am I. Kind of a different attitude with Abraham than what we saw in the Garden of Eden, wasn't it? When God wanted to know what Adam was at, they went and hid themselves, didn't they? Very, vastly different attitude. Abraham said, here am I. I'm ready. I'm yours to do whatever you direct me to do. Read.
This is almost akin to like a soldier answering to a commanding officer, the salute.
Here am I. Yep, that's right. He was ready, wasn't he? You command and I'll do it. It's a picture that we get here. So here's Abraham being very obedient to God. You know, and we talked about one of the old writers, and of course he wasn't a member of the church, Spurgeon. He had this to say, notice the obedience of this friend of God. It was no playing at giving up his son. It was really doing it. It was no talking about what he could do and would do. Perhaps, but his faith was practical and heroic. So there wasn't no talk about this. You know, last week we talked about, you know, Abraham could have got up there and done all this and then reached down to his sheath and said, Lord, I forgot my knife. Wait a minute, Brother Con, we forgot the rope to bind him with. See there, I was willing to do it, but I forgot. You know, that's an excuse, isn't it? We're trying to find excuses sometimes that we can live with, that seems acceptable in our sight. Well, God didn't accept that. See, that was a part of Abraham's faith too, wasn't it? Was his humbleness and humility, you know, and we talked about him saddling up his donkey, didn't we? Not all them servants, he done that. That was a part of his. His plan. You know, Abraham didn't say it's not fair or right. You know, very often we use that excuse. Well, I'm not going to do that. That just doesn't seem fair. You know, and that's the reason too. A lot of times that you get so many different religions going, and we have many religions in the world, and the offshoots of the offshoot, that all shot from the shot that shot out from the beginning of the Catholic Church, don't we? And yet we still find that, wait a minute, That don't seem fair. That don't seem right. I don't believe I need to do this. You don't see that in Abraham. Here am I. Here am I, Lord.
Brother, I'm gonna make a comment on that. Here am I.
Go ahead.
I'm thinking that we have mentioned, I've heard you mention it several times, that during these 3 days, you know, what might be going through the mind of Abraham.
Yeah.
And that quick answer that he gave to his son when he said, I see the wood and I see the fire, but where is the sacrifice? Well, Abraham said, the Lord will provide himself a sacrifice. Well, I think that Abraham been thinking all the time, I'm ready to do the will of the Lord, but I'm just waiting to hear from him. So when he gets this call from heaven, his name is called out real strong and loud. I'm sure he heard it real plain as day. Abraham, Abraham. He came to himself to say, well, that's what I've been waiting for. That's exactly what I've been waiting for. Some more guidance and some more instructions.
Yeah, that's a good point, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, here am I. Okay, what do you want me to do? It ties back in with Reed too. You know, a good soldier, a good soldier will listen to what the commander wants done.
Yeah.
And sometimes he waits for that decision. You know, we've seen it depicted. I heard my daddy talk about it a lot of times when you're in a dire situation in a combat zone. A lot of times your nerves are to the point to where you don't know what to do. And you're waiting for that call from the commander back at the base saying, do this, move this way, go that way. You know, artillery is coming, okay? You know, that's kind of where Abraham was, wasn't it? So, yes, here am I. Eric, would you read verses 12 through 14 for us, please?
Before you go on to the next one, Timothy just mentioned something. What you said reminded him a while ago about Isaac carrying the wood and Jesus carrying the cross.
That's right. Yeah, you brought that out. You sure did last week about Jesus carrying the cross. There is so many shadows here. You know, maybe sometimes we'll come back to this and maybe we'll do a class assignment and say, hey, why don't we go back and look at this and write down all the shadows that you can think of. And we'll turn them in, and then I'll sort them and whatever, slice and dice them in a spreadsheet, Daniel, and we'll see what it looks like. Okay, that'd be interesting, wouldn't it? Just tons of the shadows in here. Very good, very good, very good. Eric, you want?
And he said, lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen.
Yeah. And so we find Abraham being told, don't do the lad no harm. You've done what I have asked you to do, and I know in your heart you were going to sacrifice it. You know, and Reed and I talked, and I think Jeff did, and maybe Eric and I at the church about this. You know, I believe that knife was coming down. It was only pulled. Sometimes you get the thought pattern. People say, well, he wasn't coming down with that knife. He pulled it out of the sheath. Pulling out of the sheath don't mean anything. You have an intent to use it. But you know, like if I pull my keys out, what's this telling you? Well, Bobby intends to crank his truck, right? But when you see me mash this button, I'm cranking my truck, ain't I? It's the same thing here. He was following through the motion of his faith. He was going to do it. As a matter of fact, we get an indication that he was going to do it over in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. Notice what it says here. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. And so we find that his confidence in God was fulfilled. God was able to raise him up. He was going to sacrifice him. Read.
You made a great point about that last class, and where Abraham tells his servants to wait here, and the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come again to you.
Yeah, now think about that one too. Say, here we go, another shadow. I tell you what, let's do it. It's okay. For next week, ladies included, if y'all want to write down on a piece of paper what you see in this as shadows, be fine. We'll turn it in before class, and I'll slice and dice it one day next week after next, and we'll see what we come up with. How about that? I mean, I think it's very interesting myself to see what all this contains, and see what your thoughts are. It's a lot in here. It's a lot we're missing too. But yes, Reed, that's very good. And so we find that he's commanded not to do that. So Brother Con, that's what he was looking for, wasn't it? Don't do this. Well, I'm gonna do it. God said, don't you do it. I know you're gonna do it. You've demonstrated that.
Well, this verse answers it when he said, I know now that you did not withhold your only begotten son.
Yeah.
In other words, you slayed him, put him to death, but I raised him up. See, he did raise him up.
He did.
He said, that's what you read in Hebrews, said he received him back in a figure.
Right.
Same as if he had been dead, but he wasn't, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it's a real powerful thought when you get here and you look at this. And he tells Abraham, you know.
This is what you call a real Bible study.
What now, Brother Conlon?
Real Bible study.
Real Bible study.
Yeah, boy.
But you have to get in there sometime and dig around, don't you? Some of this, you know, many times as you read these things, some of this, until you get out and study it and think about it, and look at what other people have thought about it, you don't even realize what's going on in here, do you?
Yeah, this word is full of golden treasure.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And we ain't even touched the hem of the garment. You know that? I said, we ain't even touched the hem of the garment yet. You know?
Right.
Yep. So, and so we find that God says now that I know thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thy only son, from me. Well, you know, God could see that. You know, that's not the first time something like similar to this has been said about Abraham. About I know. You know, we find in Genesis chapter 18, beginning at verse 18, Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children. What did God say? This is before he was willing to sacrifice Isaac. He was still a work in process at this point. But God said, I know him. If I can get him on the right track and keep him focused, I know what he will do. And so we find that he said, I know that he will command his children, his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. The promise, right? Spoken of him. I know Abraham. Thou fearest God. You know, we find that demonstrated fear, didn't it? Abraham had got to this point in life that he had seen the demonstrations of God's power so much that he was afraid not to do it. And I'm not so sure it's fear of, like we think fear, trembling and quaking. Fear a lot of times carries with it the idea of reverence and respect. Really good.
Kind of have the exact same thing happening with another patriarch, and that's Job, where Satan says, you know, God, have you considered him?
Right.
I know him.
I know him, yeah. It's a good one. I didn't think about that. Sure did. I know him. That's right. Job is another example of someone that God said, I know. I know him. I know Job. I know Job is not going to curse me, no matter what he goes through. Now, on the other hand, this is something we usually don't get too much past verse 3 when we talk about Job. Job didn't wonder about them things. He did. Why was I born? Why was I allowed to live when I came out of my mother's womb? Why? And that's okay. You know, it doesn't hurt us sometimes to ask why and try to find the answer. We should ask why. You know, especially when it comes to things of religion. In the church, why do we do certain things? Can we answer that question? Or maybe on some basic things. Maybe can we answer somebody off the cuff and without the word? Well, why were you baptized? You know, and maybe out in the world, a lot of times people need to ask, well, preacher, reverend, doctor, PhD, so and so, why do we do this? Oh, the Bible says so. Show me. It doesn't hurt. And I think sometimes the asking of why has been kind of blocked out of our minds because, you know, in religion a lot of times, I know when I was in the Methodist church, we were taught you don't question the priest, you don't question the preacher. Okay? If he says do it, guess what you do? And if you question him, you kind of get a black mark on your side, you know? So it doesn't hurt. And a lot of times if you don't ask why, you stay stuck at where you're at. Why am I here? Why am I in this shape? What happened here? And once you answer that question, why, you can build a map to get back to where you're supposed to be, can't you? But until you ask that why, you will stay stuck in that rut. Because you don't know how to get out. Anyway, that's another story. But like Reed said, Job, I know Job. I know thou hast feared me, and thou didn't withhold thy son. Have you noticed this being repeated by an only son? Was Isaac Abraham's only son? Oh no. It was Ishmael. Ishmael was a son too he loved. That's why he petitioned God. But notice, God did not recognize Ishmael as a promised seed. Now, he recognized him as an individual. He recognized him as a person. He recognized him that he was going to bless him for a purpose and plan. But Ishmael represents a body of people, here we go, Jill, that's not recognized by God. Today, are there bodies of people that's not recognized by God? I mean, you have to stop and look at that. What body of people is recognized of God? Well, Isaac. It's the same thought, it's the same principle, it's the same shadow. So, Isaac was not recognized because he was the child that was made by man. And we have to remember that when we look at these things. Made by man. You say that's very sad, that's very tragic, but you know, that's what you get when you're dealing with man's wisdom and all. Now, we can look at the world around about us and see the interjection of man's wisdom and man's ways and the heartache it brings on. You know? We look at society today, well, that's brought on by the heartache of man. That's not brought on by God. That's brought on because of disobedience to God's word. And so we find that Isaac is recognized as the only son. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horn. Now, you know, it looks like to me, Abraham lifted up his eyes, and some of you brothers can comment on this. It's almost maybe like, you know, God has spoke to Abraham. Do you get a sense that Abraham is out of humbleness and humility, not really looking at the voice that maybe he's, okay, that's, you know. Because he lifted up. When you lift up something, what do? You pick it up. Now, I'm not going to say that the King James Version didn't use lifting, saying turning around, okay? But in my mind, that's what I see is Abraham in his humbleness and humility. He lifted up his eyes, and behold, behind him, not in front of him, not beside him, but behind him was what God had provided, the provision. Maybe a lot of times we don't see the provision because we're too busy with tunnel vision looking this way, and we can't see what God has provided behind us. It's kind of like what we say a lot of times, maybe that when you go to count your blessings, when you get into this thing about this pity pot, woe is me, poor is me, look at me, nobody's had it like me, I'm the only one, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Well, take a piece of paper, 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and take a pen and start listing how God has blessed you. In order to do that, you have to look behind, don't you? You have to look back for a minute. And after you get about halfway down that piece of notebook paper, more than likely, you know what you're gonna find? What am I grumbling about? What am I thinking like this for? You know? We have to look behind sometimes to see the provision that God has done. You know, what He's provided us with. What has He done? And here with Abraham, He's provided him with a ram in a thicket by his horns. God had provided that. You know, if the ram's in a thicket caught by his horns, he's not going anywhere, is he? And so we find that God provided this ram, and Abraham took the ram, offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. It's kind of interesting about this thicket and ram. When you think of a thicket, a lot of times you think about bushes and briars and things like that, don't you? What was Jesus' crown made of? Thorns out of a bush. Kind of interesting. Yeah, we're going to be answered the sheet, and we ain't even wrote it down. Huh? So we find, and the ram, represents Jesus. And so we find that this was provided by God and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. So in the place of Isaac, which Brother Con is right, spiritually Isaac was sacrificed, wasn't he? And raised up. He sure was. But this is what God wanted. He wanted that sacrificial offering of that lamb which represents his son. And so we find that these things happen, and we're going to find beginning in verse 14 that Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah-Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. That's a very interesting statement about it shall be seen. And so we find that Abraham didn't call this place the Mount of Abraham. He didn't call this place Happy Am I. He named it after Jehovah, didn't he? After the blessings that Jehovah had given him by providing a ram, by God showing him that he is accepted as a man of great faith, you see. And so we find that this mount here is going to play an important part in Jewish history from here on out. Because in this statement here, in the mount of the Lord, it shall be seen. What's he talking about here? What's going to be seen there in the mount of the Lord? The ultimate sacrifice for sin is going to be seen here where this event has transpired. He's talking about the sacrifice of Jesus Christ is going to take place in this same area, this mount where this took place in the future. And it's going to be a while in the future, isn't it, Brother Conner? But it's going to happen. So that's one of the places that was named Jehovah-Jireh, and it's in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. Reed, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, sir.
Okay. Eric, you got any thoughts? I know sometimes you have some good stuff laying out there. Okay. All right. Hey, Reed Griffith, do you have verses 15 through 18? Would you read those for us, please?
Sure. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven, and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of the enemies.
Okay. And here again now we find that God's going to repeat this promise that he's given to Abraham. He recognized that Abraham had not withheld his son. And I'm just going to kind of come on down here. And he said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thee. Thy seed has the stars of the heaven, and the sea has the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. Now, what you're getting into, and I'm gonna start kind of at the bottom of this, about the gate of the enemies. We find some prophecy in Daniel about the kingdom that's gonna be set up. That kingdom was gonna destroy all of the kingdoms. And it was gonna stand until God gets ready to bring the church to itself later. So we can kind of see that coming, but don't you notice, I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven. Now, you can go out there and look on the internet about this verse here, and as you're going to find where there's numbers to like 100 million to the 25th power times whatever, and they're trying to figure out the number of stars, okay? It's a number so great that it can't be written on paper, so you have to put that exponent up there on it. Daniel, I believe that's what you call that, the 25th power or the exponent, something like that. It's been so long till, anyway. And then they talk about the sands of the sea, and they do all these numbers, and you, just put it this way. It's so great you can't comprehend it. That's what he's talking about. That's how you're going to be blessed. And you know the seed that he's talking about here, in multiplying, I will multiply thy seeds. You know, Abraham had more children after Sarah died. Is he talking about those seeds? Well, for one thing, I said it wrong, didn't I? The word's not plural. It's singular. He says here, and in multiplying, I will multiply thy seed, and thy seed shall possess the gates of his enemies. It's talking about the seed of Isaac, isn't it? Okay?
My version, which is New King
Go ahead.
James, actually says descendants.
The what now?
Instead of seed there,
Uh-huh.
it says descendants.
Descendant? Okay.
Actually, and it's plural.
Huh?
And it is plural.
It is plural. Yeah, and I think what you're going to run into sometimes is the way those things are translated. When you go back and take a look at that, though, the plurality, he was going to have a plurality true of fleshly seeds. Okay, that's true, no doubt, hands down. Going to be a lot of them. I think sometimes in this, though, you kind of have to look at what's going on with this. Was the seeds in plural or descendants in plural going to be where the blessing and multiplication is going to be coming spiritually? Or was it through the seed? I think that's what you run into on that. Now, no doubt, did he have many fleshly descendants? Yeah, we can go over and look around today. Every one of them, though, first cousin did on himself. You know, and we're going to find Abraham had so many children till, you know, with Keturah. I mean, yeah, he had a lot. But what he's talking about here is those spiritual descendants through the seed of Isaac is what he's talking about here. So, yeah, very good. Thank you. Let's see. Here's when you get my age, they almost hit the air conditioning button instead of the buzzer. See, I have to do bifocal adjustment. And so we find here that he gives us, and I'll read verse 18, and here again, and in thy seed, there again, singular, shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Instead of seeds, the blessing didn't come for the bringing in the Gentiles, as we see a piece of prophecy here going on, in the future, through all the descendants, but through the one seed of Isaac. But notice, nations of the earth shall be blessed. This is where you bring in the Gentiles. You know, when you look at the Bible, God, you could say, recognizes only two classes of people. We're one race, the human race, but there's different ethnic groups and different classes of people. Well, the way God has it classified is Jew and Gentile. And Gentile simply means non-Jew. And so what he's saying here is, your seed is going to be the one that's going to bless all the nations, all the different peoples, if you will, of the earth, will be blessed in that seed. And he's talking about the bringing in of the Gentiles, which, you know, we're going to find actually happened in Acts chapter 10, didn't it? The bringing in of the Gentiles is going to happen. So, you know, all this is talking about what's going to happen in the future, all because one man was willing to sacrifice. Now, we can talk about the power of one, if you want. All because of what one man was willing to do. One man was willing to give up self, to give up his way, and in a sense, Abraham was a great sheep. Give up his riches, humble himself, saddle his donkey, gather wood, so on and so forth, and look at the blessing. All because of what one did. It's a powerful thought when you stop and think about what Abraham did. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And we know, as we come through the Old Testament, look at Old Testament prophecy, that what it's talking about here is the bringing in the Gentiles, but these earthly kingdoms would not be the source by which the blessing would come. And I think sometimes this is where your idea about some of the doctrines out in the world about setting up an earthly kingdom, somehow the blessings of all is going to come through an earthly kingdom, it was never under consideration. Nowhere do you find it ever being under consideration. And so we know that Paul said that he had reconciled both Jew and Gentile as one in his body. So that's the oneness he's talking about here. We're all distinct personalities, aren't we? We're all different. We all have different facial features. We all have different heights and weights. And our minds, in a lot of ways, are very similar, but sometimes our thought patterns are different. But through the seed of Jesus Christ, we're reconciled as one mind in one body. Where else can you find that being reconciled in one mind in one body? Now, when you try to reconcile man into one mind and one body, the first thing you're going to do is get a big uproar about what mind and what body. I don't agree with you on that. I don't want that. And I'm going to get my gun, and I'm going to go get you, and all this kind of stuff, right? But that's not the way the body of Christ works. The reconciliation is the circumcision of the heart. That's why we can be in an agreement on a thus saith the Lord, Brother Con. Because that baptism circumcised the heart. I guess there's another shadow there we could use, Reed. We ain't run out yet, have we? And I'm about out of time, so I tell you what we're going to do. Why don't we pick up at verse 19 for next week. It'll be a good starting point, and we'll kind of go from there, because we do want to take a look at maybe not too much in depth about Rachel coming into the picture, being a part of Abraham's family, which, as far as God's concerned, is the beginning of the people of God. And we can see the shadow of the church. And one of the things to think about in this, and then I'll close this out. As we look at this, you're going to find that God did not recognize a concubine and their children. And we can see that today. These concubines, these children are a shadow of denominationalism that was going to come. That's why the recognition wasn't there. Isaac is recognized as a promised sacrifice, and we can see that through Jesus Christ in the church. Rebekah is looked at as God's people. He went to God's people to get a wife. Well, where's God's people at today for Jesus to get the bride? It's in the church. And unfortunately, if you want to use it that way, Ishmael and his concubine really denote denominationalism that was brought on by man. And you're going to see that in that, with these concubines and all, there's always continuous problems. So who brought the problem up? Man or God? God said one man, one woman. So we'll stop right there and get ready for our worship service.